Hi there, so it's Rochelle from Regional CoLab. Today we thought we'd have a bit of a chat about what is a really big issue in the news at the moment. So the ANAO audit of the Community Sport Infrastructure Grant Program that was administered by the Australian Sports Commission, also known as Sport Australia, is in the news right now. And the politicians involved are wading around in some very hot water, as you probably know. What you need to know and what we want to explain about what's going on is a bit about the background of what's going on, and then we'll talk about a little bit of stuff at the end around grant programs and tendering and that sort of stuff, and what we can do to help people and why it's important to seek some professional advice when you're doing this kind of grant work. So let's get into it. The key rationale for undertaking an audit in the first instance is that Sport Australia is what's known as a corporate Commonwealth entity. So because they're a corporate Commonwealth entity, they're not subject to the Commonwealth grants rules and guidelines when administering grants programs. This is a quirk that happens across government. It happens in tendering as well. It's not unusual. There's nothing untoward about this. It's just the way that legislation has been drafted and how it works. So in a nutshell, the audit was referred by the Shadow Attorney General, the Honourable Mark Dreyfus, and it was asked to be assessed whether the award of the funding was informed by an appropriate assessment process and sound advice. So in a nutshell, the answer was no. Whilst the ANAO found that the program guidelines were in fact well structured and included clear assessment criteria, as well as really transparent weightings, which is a great thing, there were deficiencies, and these included that there were no records explaining proper process management, and there were insufficient conflict of interest procedures in place. Where the political issues have occurred are because whilst the program guidelines identified that the Minister for Sport would approve the funding, there were no records showing that the Minister was provided appropriate legal advice regarding the basis on which this approval role could be undertaken. So in any of these sorts of processes, whether it's in tendering or whether it's in grants, you always have to have files with information and evidence to show that you've made the correct interpretation of guidelines and legislation. So what's been found is that there wasn't actually a huge amount of information provided around the legal advice. So the lines have been blurred. Many would say they've been crossed. We don't want to, at Regional CoLab, get into that particular political quagmire. It really does depend on your perspective, and you're totally entitled to it. We just wanted to provide some information around what's going on and to give, I guess, a bit of clarity around what this sort of issue is and how moving forward you can sort of make sure that as a grant writer or requester that you still meet criteria and do all of the work that you need to do to hopefully get a good outcome. So the ANAO found that Sports Australia's assessment of applications was largely in accordance with the published program guidelines. However, even though eligibility was assessed against the 3 published merit criteria, which is a good thing, where Sport Australia itself overstepped the mark was they ranked the applications within the 3 funding streams that were part of the grant application. This was not consistent with the guidelines. So the guidelines didn't say we're going to assess these 3 merit criteria within these other 3 funding streams. So people weren't aware, so they couldn't make an application that addressed those particular requirements. I've worked in tendering and grants and procurement in that environment for pretty much the majority of my career. And the issue here is around probative process. There are guidelines and assessment criteria, obviously, so that you can look at making sure that you create a fair and transparent outcome. And that's what the issue is at the moment, is people feel that there wasn't a fair and transparent outcome. And obviously, all of the other conversations are around pork barrelling, which, I think that you'd have to be, hiding under a rock not to recognise that that sort of stuff does and can happen within our political environment. Again, I don't want to get involved in having that conversation because that's not really what we're about at Regional CoLab. So the issue that we're hearing about in the media relates to the finding that the Minister's Office had commenced its own assessment process, and the Minister's Office drew upon considerations that were inconsistent with what the published guidelines were stating. So therefore, as suggested, the playing field, for want of a sports analogy, I apologise for that, for want of a fair playing field, it was unfair at least, and at worst, it was unknown. So this revelation, quite rightly, has people up in arms, and what we want to explain from a regional collab perspective is that when we harp on about meeting guidelines and criteria, we do so for a reason. Yes, this is a disappointing story. However, with an ANAO review, what you now can be sure about is that all grants programs moving forward will become way more vigilant about their assessment criteria and appropriate outcomes. So here at Regional Collab, the reason that we talk about helping you through that maze or that quagmire of grants is that we take the approach, if you can't meet criteria, it's not worth wasting your time on an application. So we're here to help you navigate your way through that maze and make sure that each and every application that you submit does have the best chance of success. So I hope that this conversation has helped you clarify what's going on with regards to the Sports Australia saga at the moment. It happens, it's happened before, it will happen again, but what you can be assured of is that moving forward, grant applications will probably have a much higher level of assessment requirement. Certainly grant and tender evaluations are going to be looked at much more closely through the microscope. So essentially what that says is just make sure that when you're applying for any of these grants or tenders or anything else, that you address criteria and that you're really clear about what your project can do, what it will achieve, and what impact you'll have within your community. Hope this has been helpful, and I'll talk to you again soon.